order, which I don't really, I'm teaching it
All right, ladies and gentlemen, it's a little bit past the allotted time, so we'll go ahead and get started. At some point, the final speaker, Professor Claris, is going to be coming in, so we'll just start without him, and organically he will appear. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Michael Scharf. I'm the co-dean of the law school, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you here this afternoon for this really timely panel on international economic policy under the Trump administration, which, believe it or not, begins tomorrow with the inauguration. We've been having all week a series of panels and events to talk about what the new administration will mean for the law and for law students and people in the university community. There he is. So let's see, tomorrow we're having a teach-in all day. And this was organized by the Student Bar Association, and faculty are going to a series of panels on all kinds of issues that the students want to talk about. So if you want to spend your Friday with us, sort of figuring out what this all means, please come back. A lot of you were here, I think, yesterday. We had a really interesting panel on what the Trump administration or the Trump presidency means for Muslims. And this was standing room only, and there's a lot of concern and a lot of heated debate. Now, for me, economic policy is every bit as much exciting, and I can tell you it's every bit as important. And so we're going to hear today about that. Let me just tell you some upcoming things that are coming to the law school and invite you to come to those. On March 3rd, from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m., we have our second annual Human Trafficking Law Symposium. On March 9th at 4:30, we have the Klatsky Lecture in Human Rights, and our speaker is Michael Posner, who was the Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights, and he's the founder of the Lawyers Committee for Human Rights, one of the foremost NGOs dedicated to human rights that involves lawyers. And then from March 30th to 31st, we have the annual Canada-U.S. Law Conference, and the title there is State of our nation's Canada-U.S. perspectives on law, policy, and politics in tumultuous times. They certainly do seem to be tumultuous times, but as President Obama said as he was leaving, don't totally freak out. He has faith that America can endure all kinds of change, and this one is going to be exciting. So let's hear what is in store for our international economic policy, and the organizer of this event, Professor Webster, will introduce the speakers, and we're in for a great time. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, guys. Okay, so as Dean Scharf just mentioned, we've had a number of these panels about what the Trump administration means for various areas of law. Towards the end of last semester, my colleague Avi Cover put together a great panel on immigration under the Trump administration, and that gave me an idea that we should have a similar conversation about what international economics is going to look like under a Trump administration. And for those of you who were here last night, the panel on national security and Muslims in particular was also another one of these very successful panels that I think we've had here at the law school. This panel is similar to that, but what I wanted to do is rather than focus on the legal community is to take advantage of the fact that we are at a major research university. I sometimes forget in this little fief called the law school that I actually have incredibly brilliant colleagues that have offices all of 50 feet away from me. So it has been also good for me to reach out and to talk to economists and talk to political scientists. I think each of us sometimes feel that we live in our own little world and don't realize that a stone's throw away are a whole hive of brilliant people buzzing with good ideas. So I'm delighted to introduce a little bit later some of our colleagues from outside of the law school. So let me just first make a couple of comments about what I want to accomplish here. I'll then introduce our panel. I have prepared a few questions for them, and then, of course, as always, we open it up to the floor and hope that you guys will have some questions or comments or concerns that you'd like to air and get some great feedback and great questions, great answers to your questions. So the election of President-elect Trump for one last day, in November has had major implications for a whole range of policies, and particularly in the field of international economics, trade, investment, there's going to be a lot of repercussions, or potentially a lot of repercussions. Now, you will recall that during the campaign, at that point, candidate Trump made a number of off the hand, off the mark, or off the cuff comments about what he would do as president. And I think that put him at odds with certainly Democrats and even a number of Republicans. And so we need to understand what that actually means. So what am I talking about? Things like we would withdraw from the World Trade Organization, the United States that is. We would withdraw from NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. We would withdraw from NAFTA. We would impose sanctions or tariffs on goods from Mexico and China. President-elect Trump also repeated Mitt Romney's promise in 2012 to label China a currency manipulator on day one. That would be tomorrow, for those of you paying attention, and so on and so forth. Now, as we've seen candidate Trump morph into President-elect Trump and tomorrow into President Trump, what we've seen is he has walked back on a number of those claims, and I think that's generally a good thing. We're now slowly learning not to take President-elect Trump at his word or at his tweet, but to see this sort of as a noisy signal about where he may be going in the future. So, for example, he's not going to appoint a special prosecutor to go after Hillary Clinton. He's not going to make Mexico pay for the wall. He's going to send them a bill in a few years. Climate change is no longer a Chinese hoax, as it once was, but is now something he's going to look at, quote, very carefully. And he has downgraded the ban on all Muslims to merely a registry and extreme vetting of Muslims from certain countries. Now, I don't need to make light of that, but I think this shows that unlike what some people were saying at last night's discussion, you can't take Trump at his word. I don't even think Trump takes Trump at Trump's word. And we've also seen some of the people he's nominated to cabinet posts disagree with him on a wide range of issues, from Russia to torture and to economic policy as well. So again, what we're doing here is to try to figure out what these signals that Trump has emitted, what they may tell us about international economics under his presidency. Let me now turn to brief introductions of our extremely distinguished and very international panel. I'll begin with my colleague here in the law school, Juscelino Colares, who's the Schott van den Einden Professor of Business Law. Professor Colares is actually a tenured professor in his native Brazil before coming to this country to continue his education, getting a PhD and a JD in law at Cornell, after which he worked for a major international law firm. He then clerked for Jean-Louis Debré, who is the président, or the chief justice of the Conseil Constitutionnel, the Constitutional Court in Paris. And he also taught at l'École Normale Supérieure in Paris. He's also, I think, perhaps most relevant to today's discussion. He is on a panel, or he's on a roster, I should say, of panelists for NAFTA trade disputes. So he's going to come and tell us what NAFTA means, what trade law means, and what obstacles or potential obstacles President-elect Trump may face if he wants to radically shift NAFTA. Next, and to my immediate right, is Professor Susan Helper, who is the Frank Tracy Carlton Professor at the Weatherhead School. She is formerly a chief economist at the United States Department of Commerce and has published widely on supply chain management and manufacturing, again, things that are very, very important to Donald Trump and very, very important to this country. In her distinguished career, Professor Helper has also held visiting positions at Oxford, Berkeley, MIT, and Harvard. In the middle, we have Professor Elliot Posner from the Political Science Department. His research examines international cooperation, regulatory power, and market formation. These are all themes he explored in his first book called The Origins of Europe's New Stock Markets. He too brings considerable international experience. He's been a Fulbright scholar in the EU. He's been a visiting scholar at Sciences Po and also at Bruegel, the Belgian think tank. So with those two brief introductions, let me now turn to some of the substance of the panel. And let's begin close to home by asking some questions about NAFTA, one of these things that President-elect Trump has vowed to shred or to defang or alter in some fundamental way. Again, to use the language of Trump, to him it was the single worst trade deal ever approved in this country. That's a direct quote. But I think it would be helpful before we shred or trash NAFTA to understand what it actually does. And from an international lawyer's perspective, it does, or it regulates 4 different disciplines: trade, investment, labor, and environment. And obviously the trade piece is going to be most germane to our discussion today. Just very briefly, what NAFTA does is lower tariffs on goods that are produced in the other 2 countries. So here in the United States, because of NAFTA, we apply a lower tariff on goods made in Canada and on goods made in Mexico than we would on goods, say, produced in Japan or China or Europe, because we have what we call a free trade agreement, or perhaps more accurately, a freer trade agreement with those 2 countries. Now, what NAFTA also does is to when determining that tariff, it has what it calls rules of origin, or ROOs, R-O-O. And this is the standards, these are the tools by which each of these countries determines whether a product has enough local content to qualify for that reduced tariff. And so to give a concrete example, most products have to have up to 50% or more of their value derived and sourced locally, right? So you can still take parts from other parts of the world. You can take German carburetors or what have you, but half of the value of that good has to be produced in a NAFTA country in order for it to be considered a NAFTA good and avail itself of that lower tariff. Certain products, though, like cars and the automobile manufacturing is obviously pretty critical to this discussion here, have higher levels. So for cars in particular, it has to be a 62.5% of the value has to be locally sourced in order for the product to avail itself of that lower tariff. And going back to the early 90s, when NAFTA was actually negotiated, that was a concession to the American automobile industry, which was concerned that Honda or Toyota or Nissan or BMW or Mercedes would set up shop in Mexico and then export cheap cars to the United States. So he said, well, for most goods, it's going to be 50%, but for cars, we're going to have a higher threshold in order to take advantage of that lower tariff. So that's, in a nutshell, what NAFTA does, at least as far as trade is concerned. So let me begin. I know Professor Helper has thought a lot about manufacturing. I know Professor Kolaris has broad expertise in NAFTA. I'm sure Professor Posner has some thoughts as well. But let's talk a little bit about for example, what NAFTA does. Will the threat of raising a 35% tariff on Mexico violate NAFTA? And more generally, what do we think about this idea of bringing manufacturing back and doing so potentially with protectionist or other devices to accomplish that? So maybe we could go down the row here. Professor Helper, Professor Posner, and then Professor Kolaris, if you'd care to weigh in on this question about what NAFTA does and what leaving NAFTA or weakening NAFTA might mean for manufacturing and the economy in the United States. If you please.
Cool. Well, I will try to keep myself to just a couple minutes. This
Sure.
is quite a wide range of questions. So I think one question, can we bring manufacturing back? I think so. One way to look at manufacturing in the U.S. is there's been about 15 to 17 million manufacturing jobs in the U.S. constantly since about 1970. Between about 1965 and 2000, there were about 17 million manufacturing jobs. In 2000, that number fell off a cliff. And there's pretty good economic research that suggests that a pretty big percentage of that was trade actually with China. China's a much bigger economy than Mexico is. So if I was going to, I think the 2 big drivers of this change were China entering the WTO and NAFTA. NAFTA, I think, was probably more important to this particular region because of its impact on the auto industry. So, for example, the largest private employer in Mexico is Delphi, as a auto parts maker. They used to have about 20,000 jobs or so in Warren. Now they have a few hundred. And you can make those things over. I would actually argue that the impact of NAFTA was not so much in the tariffs, but on the other three areas, that either affirmative action to protect investors and a affirmative non-action to protect labor and the environment. And so that the tariffs there was some variation in what the tariffs were from Mexico, but they weren't that high. And the main thing that people got, investors got from Mexico, was a certainty that sort of baked into Mexican political economy was a sort of, neoliberal view that the investments in Mexico wouldn't be expropriated, that special courts were set up for investors, that they could argue whether they were treated unfairly, and these courts, in principle, could overturn. I mean, it's a bilateral or a reciprocal obligation. In principle, these courts could overturn decisions of high courts in any country, including the U.S. Supreme Court. We haven't actually seen that, but that potential remains. So I guess I'm not sure about NAFTA being the worst trade agreement ever invested, but I do think that Trump has done us a favor, and I'm actually grateful to Trump for this one somewhat narrow thing. I mean, I think that he has broken this kind of elite logjam of consensus that there's sort of one way to do globalization. It's inevitable. It cannot be challenged. And I think elites of both parties have really failed a lot of workers. And so to talk about China, the WTO, is very good research by the chair of the economics department at MIT, David Autor, that the Chinese entry to the WTO for about 20 years caused, in the most trade-affected regions, caused a loss of about $1,000 per working age adult in these communities. So it wasn't just the manufacturing workers who lost their jobs, that those people then crowded into service jobs and other kinds of things. So this is a big impact. There are gains from trade. I do believe that. I haven't totally turned in my economist card, but they're relatively small. We haven't done anything really to protect the losers, who tend to be among the more vulnerable members of society. People like us in this room, we benefit. We get a lot of cheap clothes, but we haven't taken any of those gains really and compensated people. I think that we could with a kind of different orientation to trade, but I've gone on long enough.
Thanks. Thanks, Tim and Michael, for inviting me. Thanks for coming this afternoon. So those are very interesting points, and I hadn't tied them. I largely agree with your point that there's lots of different ways to arrange cross-border exchange, and I just hadn't tied it to thanking Trump for that, but I see your point. I do see your point. So I'm not a NAFTA expert, but I have a couple of things I'd like to say. In part because I'm an EU scholar, and so I like to talk about NAFTA in my classes as because it provides a great contrast to the way that the Europeans have sought to integrate their economies. So what stands out is that unlike the EU, NAFTA was designed to keep people in their own countries, right? Because one of the founding principles of the European Union project is that people, along with capital, goods, and services, should be mobile. But NAFTA was designed specifically to, I thought, maybe I'm wrong, he's shaking his head, so good, Juscelino, but I thought that...
The design and the outcome, I think, would be different.
Okay, yeah, I'd like to hear which is which, because I thought, which, I mean, and so for me, the rhetoric, the populist rhetoric of Trump is sort of an impossible, you can't have both an effort to undermine NAFTA, which I thought was designed to keep Mexicans in Mexico, and also put up a wall. See, there's contradictory policy. So I thought, so that would be my NAFTA contribution. And the other question I have stemming from my classes, which you addressed, Sue, and I hope we can think more about it, is I would have said, I guess I didn't know about Delphi and the play, certainly for this part, but I would have said that overall, the effects, the economic effects of NAFTA have not lived up to the projected effects. And I just want to know how true that is. I thought the reason, the big reason was because, as you say, China comes into the picture at exactly the same time and was so overwhelming for the world economy and for, in terms of U.S. manufacturing, but also other areas of the economy in this country. That so I'm just wondering where we are with that. If that's true, still the same.
Uh, Thank you for organizing this, Tim. Thank you, Dean Scharf, for introducing us. Thank you for Susan and Elliot for your comments. I would just like to say that to start off, that we are coming we were bound to come at a point where the trends on globalization and trade and liberalization uh, could no longer proceed. Uh, the United States will formally notify Canada of its intent to reopen NAFTA talks within days of tomorrow, of the inauguration of the new president. NAFTA is only the beginning of what we are about to see. The United States has for far too long negotiated trade agreements that put supply chains way ahead, and the preservation of supply chains, these very complex industrial arrangements where inputs are produced in different countries, and through these rules of origins, you can get almost free flow of trade with lower tariffs, with a net loser in the United States being the labor class. If the United States elite had done the same thing to the labor class in the United States, to working labor, to manufacturing labor, that it did to lawyers, to doctors, right, and to different professions, we would have a much different appreciation of free trade and what free trade has wrought in our society than we have today. Of course, it is lawyers and highly educated people that basically get to write opinion pieces in the New York Times and that get to have their views reflected in public policy. So the order of the day is going to change. The United States is not going to put not touching, not disturbing supply chains in a pedestal to the sacrifice of the working Americans, and to the sacrifice of the enormous bilateral leverage that it has as the world's as one individual country biggest consumer market, and as the world's most integrated, most liberalized economy. Levels of tariffication in the United States, if you count all goods, including those that are not tariffed, they are less than 1.6%. Levels of tariffications, then if you count only products that are tariffed or subject to tariffs, they are about 2.5%. So we already have liberalized. We've been waiting for the world to do this. The world hasn't done it. We have run an industrial policy over many years, and that industrial policy has been clear. It's an industrial policy that favors the financial services industry and agricultural subsidies. That is how we destroyed Mexican agriculture with our agricultural subsidies, and thereby aggravating immigration, which NAFTA was, by the way, supposed to mitigate and correct. It never did, it never could, because we never stopped subsidizing agriculture to the levels that the Europeans and that the Chinese have done, and of course, because of political reasons. And we have run what amounts to a trade liberalizing agenda that heavily favors a particular sector of the economy, the financial services industry. So just don't believe for one second what you hear in the media, that we don't have industrial policy in the United States. We absolutely do. And we have had one that since FDR that has constantly privileged the financial services industry to the detriment of working Americans. This is going to change. The appointments for Secretary of Commerce, Wilbur Ross, a former executive of in the steel industry, the consolidated steel mills. Some would call him a corporate raider. Some would other call him the person who saved the steel industry, the remaining steel industry, or helped save in the United States. Dan D'Amico, a former CEO of Nucor Corporation, a very efficient steel producer from North Carolina, is the head, is basically the guy who's picking the team together. You have Bob Lighthizer as USTR, U.S. Trade Representative, the foremost trade lawyer in D.C. We used to share, before I entered my firm, we used to share a client with him, U.S. Steel. And so we're going to have a top team that is basically focused on creating this notion of an American desk, of no longer allowing USTR to negotiate trade deals that are perverse to the working class, or to the American middle class.
Okay, good. Well, thank you guys for your initial thoughts. I want to dig down a little bit deeper into this issue of manufacturing and tariffs. And you know, the working class, I think we've seen has suffered quite a lot under NAFTA over the past 20 years or so. But what's the best way to move forward, right? So there's this idea that Trump and others have floated about slapping a 35% tariff on goods made in Mexico. The reality is that economists differ, but they say 35 to 40% of the value of the goods produced in Mexico come from the United States, right? So if you apply a tariff to goods in Mexico which use parts made in the United States, what's the economic effect of that, or how is that going to harm or affect, I should say, the creators or the manufacturers of those parts on this side of the Rio Grande? And then more specifically, Professor Halper, you're probably best positioned to answer this. What are the prospects for a large-scale return of manufacturing? Is this something that we currently have the capacity, the knowledge, the resources to do in an effective way, or are our resources better deployed towards training or education or finding alternative careers for those who have been displaced by the outsourcing or offshoring of manufacturing?
Yeah, so just because I'm grateful to Trump for raising the issue doesn't mean I agree with his solutions. And so I think he, so there's one thing that he has done that I think is actually quite, has its positive aspects, and I think that's the job owning of American companies. I'm not necessarily thrilled about the threats, but I think telling them this is not a patriotic thing, that actually has an impact. A lot of these decisions are actually quite close. People tend, when they look at manufacturing, they look at wage rates in Mexico, which are a couple dollars an hour compared to maybe 18 to 20 or something here, and they think, how can you possibly compete with that? And the answer is, well, particularly in manufacturing, labor costs are a pretty small part of costs, less than 10%. So you can overcome high wages with innovative policies. So an example of this is Germany has higher wages than we do, but has about twice, manufacturing is twice as big a part of its economy as in the U.S. So it's possible to have, we don't have to compete with Mexico by doing what Mexico does. And so a lot of companies are starting to realize this job owning, I think has caused people to take a second look, sharpen their pencils. I think that's actually a good thing. These changes in tariffs, which is the main thing that he's talked about, while I don't think it necessarily is going to have the catastrophic impacts that the elite defenders of current supply chain policy think it will have, I think it will be disruptive. And I think we saw some of this with some of the Bush and Reagan steel tariffs that Mr. Lighthizer actually oversaw. And the problem is what economists call the effective rate of protection. So there was high tariffs on steel, made it, it was great for producing steel in the US, but there weren't tariffs uniformly on things that made using steel. So if you bought some Chinese or Korean steel, embodied it in a car, and then shipped that car to the US, well, that wasn't subject to a big tariff. So it had some disruptive and not great effects on the steel using sectors. And so I don't necessarily see, it doesn't seem like policy coherence is going to be a hallmark of this administration. And I'm not sure that we're going to see that kind of coherent policy where you'd like to sort of think about what are the industries you want to bring back, how are you going to do it. That's the first problem. Second problem is, I'd love to see a change to these, the investor state dispute resolution system, which is these special courts for investors that they get access to and only they get access to. We talk about protectionism, as Juscelino is saying that we have a trade regime that actually does quite a good job of protecting investors in the finance sector. It would be interesting and useful to think about protecting the environment and workers as well. And then thirdly, we need a coherent domestic policy. A lot of supply chains actually remain domestic. We all know about the Apple supply chain and how global it is. That is actually not the typical case. If a final good is made in the U.S., about almost 80% of the content on average of that good comes from the U.S. But these have been hollowed out. A lot of it's moved to Mexico. So I think, and the Obama administration, and I guess I'm proud to have played a role in this, I think we thought deeply about how do you think about the kinds of benefits that manufacturing has for the economy as a whole, and how do you promote that kind of manufacturing that has that benefit and do it in a way that's not crony capitalism, that's not picking winners. And so the way that we came up with was sort of thinking about innovation and wages. Those are the kinds of two sorts of spillover benefits that spill over to the rest of the economy, and set up a number of institutions. So some of them cost money, like the Manufacturing USA set of manufacturing hubs, the first one of which was in Youngstown, and Case Western is a partner in it. But also just convening people, convening communities that do manufacturing, getting people to talk together, to learn about new opportunities to make innovative products, et cetera. Love to see for that to continue under a Trump administration. I'm not sure it will.
Okay, so let me make 3 points here. The first one is, I guess it picks up on some of the things that Sue just said. There's a full range, and again here I'm talking as an EU scholar. There's a full range of mechanisms available that for integrating economies and for making trade arrangements compatible in a pluralistic world, increasingly pluralistic world. So in Europe, you'll find a smorgasbord of domestic level institutional arrangements that help cushion the negative sides of trade. I'm, in my own work, I've been interested in the mechanisms, the international, the cross-border mechanisms, and again, in Europe, you find this vocabulary that seems to be absent in the public discourse in the United States for integrating economies. Everything from, they talk about mutual recognition, harmonization, convergence. They've got, I'm telling you, if you've been to Europe or paid attention to this, so there's, again, the point is there's a lot of ways to integrate economies, because I think what you're getting at, Tim, is how should we think about ways to make international trade more compatible with values and that we hold dearly, such as equality and other things. And that leads to my second point, which is it's not just the populism we've seen is not being fueled just by, I guess what we'd say, the losers of international trade, the economic losers. It's also about values, because international trade, and you see this because it's reflected in the wars between the EU and the US. over how to regulate food safety, medicines, data privacy, chemicals, intellectual property, the environment. So I guess what I'm saying here is that trade reveals these different value systems. And so I point, again, there's a whole way you can think about how to trade in a world where values clash. Um, some of the answers is you try to work it out, but that's not always going to be possible. And so I guess here we have to think about what might be the limits. Does it make sense to be trading with all countries, or just with some in certain industries that share the same values you have, whether it's about chemicals or whether it's about workers' rights? So my last point here, if we're going to have popular support for an international economy, we have to think really hard about how we frame the political debates. And I guess because I'm a trained political scientist, I've always been sensitive to the fact that the decades-old, the centuries-old dichotomy between you're either a free trader or a protectionist, it gets too much play in this country. It's not going to work going forward. You can understand why professional economists have at various times wanted to play it that way, but I think going forward, it's going to come across as dishonest. So I think we have to think about how to frame these issues so that we can be upfront about the negative consequences, about the value stuff I just talked about the whole range of problems that come along with it, as well as what's going to be done about that at the same time that the trade arrangements are being constructed. So I'll stop there.
I'm going to try to get to the big picture too, but I'm just going to Tim's question on the 35% tariff. I think that's a number that's thrown out there just for impact, for effect. The much bigger thing is the reopening of NAFTA that is going to happen, and in that reopening of NAFTA, which is just step number one. What that does, it recognizes a couple of things. Two, there's a rebalancing in North America, right, in the North American continent, based on the new realities of these economies. The United States, when it signed NAFTA, CUFSTA, the Canada-United States Free Trade Agreement in the 80s, was much more dependent on foreign oil than it is now. Today, it's more self-reliant. It needed access to Canadian natural resources. Now it still needs access to those, but it can get that. It can source that from other sources now, at lower cost, and it produces a lot more oil itself. Mexico used to be a major exporter of natural gas to the United States. The United States actually exports gas to Mexico today. So the relationship was due for some rebalancing, and that is what we're about to see. With respect to the prospects, your second question on large scale for the return of manufacturing, people tend to forget the United States is still it's the second largest manufacturing economy in the world. Only in 2011 it was overpassed by China. It's a smaller portion of our GDP. It's only about 11%, hovers around that number. But we still have a lot of capacity, and we still have a lot of room to grow. It hasn't been so long that we've lost a lot of skills that we used to have. That can be, as Susan discussed, it can be revamped, and we can do. With one major advantage, we have liberalized far more than any other economy. If we just stop being subservient to the gods of the supply chain dictates, we can actually go back to being very competitive. One good example of this. Look at at the bailout of GM and Chrysler just 8 years ago. President Obama basically never took enough credit, as much credit as he should have, on because he's really not passionate about trade. He doesn't. He thinks on much broader, I think, levels, which to his great detriment, to the detriment of all Democrats. But look at what was done. The United States intervened in a particular sector, and U.S. industry today, automobile industry is doing very well. American trucks are far better than trucks made by any other manufacturing. Toyota, Nissan, they don't touch American trucks. American sedans have caught up. They are excellent, and you've seen a U.S. industry make a big comeback. So it's not gonna come back to what it used to be. It can never be. That would be unrealistic. But it's gonna come back to more niche manufacturing. The problem is, as Mr. Don D'Amico learned when he was a CEO of Nucor in the 90s, he was usually reticent, being a true Republican, of tariffs and anti-dumping extra tariffs to help U.S. industry compete with foreign producers that are dumping in the U.S. market, largely because they are subsidized by their own governments. And Mr. D'Amico operated a very superb company, Nucor, very efficient, mini meals. They were not really subject to much of much pressure, much international pressure, because they could outcompete countries on price because they had very efficient mills. Until PNTR, and for those who are not familiar with trade language, permanent normal trade relations with China was approved in 2000, at the very end of 2000, courtesy of another Democrat, President Bill Clinton. What you saw was China entering into the niche steel manufacturing segment as well, and then soon enough you had Nucor get religion, right? They finally believed in anti-dumping duties because the Chinese started doing their magic. So the issue is, in one of the most famous Federal Circuit cases, which is the highest court of the land other than the Supreme Court on trade issues, is Nucor Steel, a case that basically recognizes how WTO commitments do not apply out of their own force in the United States. Again, these are examples that the United States industry can compete. It can make a comeback. It just needs to stop competing with supply chains or the dominance of the supply chain mentality that has been the consensus in the past at least since Reagan, since President Reagan. So this whole redesign of the model trade agreement that Future Secretary Ross mentioned yesterday in his hearings, this notion that now it's not only going to be only USTR doing these negotiations, but the National Foreign Trade Council, which is a new trade agency, and Wilbur Ross at Commerce. It's going to be these three agencies that are going to do anything that has to do with negotiations. So it's no longer, we're back to, in a way, history repeats itself. It used to be that the State Department, USTR was created because the State Department, because of geopolitical concerns of the United States, was giving away the farm, right? Because it was a Cold War, and the State Department basically was giving away the farm, was negotiating deals, was just making it all happen, giving it all a lot of our leverage for free to other countries to secure political support. We were in a Cold War. USTR was created exactly to combat that. But again, guess what happens to USTR? It gets completely, over the years, co-opted by stakeholders, industry, and multinational corporations that are really all about making their lives easier. I mean, they don't care where they want to produce at the lowest cost, and they want to keep the U.S. economy open for access. And now we're seeing we're going again back to the drawing board with this American desk idea, where within the White House you're going to have National Foreign Trade Council. Peter Navarro is going to be heading that. You're going to have Wilbur Ross at Commerce, and Bob Lighthizer at USTR. They are going to sit and meet with the president, and they're going to fashion this new model trade agreement, which is going to be quite a departure from prior Republican and Democrat. So people act surprised why a Democrat could not make a compelling case on trade, and you see exactly why the Democrat why the Republican candidate was successful in the Midwest, because you have for the first time a Republican candidate that was, with all his pros and cons, that gave a very clear message on how he would on how he would change the status quo, a message that Hillary Clinton could never and did never convey to the public.
Okay. So I'm going to ask one more question, and then, as I said at the beginning, I'd like to hear from the audience if you guys have some questions. And I want to pick up a theme that Sue and others on the panel have talked about and just mentioned, this idea of reopening NAFTA. And my concern is that for the past 70 years, the U.S. has designed and implemented a rules-based system, right? We have the World Trade Organization, we have the United Nations bodies, we have NATO, we have free trade agreements, and as we've seen, some of the economic effects of those have harmed workers. On the flip side of that, the U.S. has actually exerted a huge amount of power over other countries' legal systems by virtue of these free trade agreements, right? So when China joined the World Trade Organization, or when Poland signs a BIT, a bilateral investment treaty with the United States, they have to up their IP protections. And again, the reason that's important to the United States is because we are a technologically advanced country. A lot of our a lot of our companies make money when IP is protected. So this raises a couple of questions. One, does Trump signify a move away from this rules-based order that has been, for many countries, a harbinger of peace and prosperity? Two, are we going to see sort of a one-off, I'm going to apply tariffs unless, Toyota, if you move to Mexico, I'm going to apply a tariff to you, which is, in my opinion, antithetical to what a legal system does, which is supposed to apply rules to everybody, right? And if we sort of have this one-offsmanship, what are we doing to the legal order that we, as lawyers, should be concerned about? And finally, if we reopen NAFTA or reopen the World Trade Organization or reopen NATO, are we going to lose our credibility, right? There's this idea in international law of pact sunt servanda, meaning international agreements are supposed to be respected. They're supposed to be implemented. And if you keep on reneging on this or renegotiating that, I fear that U.S. credibility as the leader in economics and politics and security and so forth may be diminished. So those are three small questions, but ones that I'd love to hear the rest of our panel mull over. And then, as I said, we'd love to hear from you guys as well. So maybe we'll continue along the order if that's cool with all of you. Sue, would you like to take a whack at that?
Sure. So on this sort of rules-based order, I'm in general in favor of rules. I did think that the carrier deal was bad in the sense of kind of singling out an individual company and then bribing them essentially with $7 million in tax dollars to just sort of not close its plant or something for some unspecified time.
Carrier was a company in Indiana that was threatening to move to Mexico until Mike Pence from Indiana and Donald Trump stepped in with blandishments to get them to stay.
So clearly not a rules-based, it was a deal. On the other hand, I think the content of these rules matter. And so these rules have been skewed toward investors. I've mentioned the investor-state dispute resolution a few times. The intellectual property law I actually see as also quite problematic in that there's an argument in what USTR will tell you when you sit in negotiations over any policy, as I did when I was in DC, that, we're just implementing U.S. law. But U.S. intellectual property law is actually quite, probably many experts here that I'm going to run roughshod over, but my understanding is that U.S. intellectual property law is quite a balance. There's a lot of discussion of fair use. There's a lot of ability to use things. We have policies against maybe not always most effective against evergreening. And what we put in our trade agreements are the most pro owner of IP interpretation. And this has actually, I think, very bad implications for access to medicines, for example. So I think, I'm not in favor of just having rules. I think what the content of the rules matters a lot. And so then that brings me, I guess, to the credibility issue. I'm old enough to remember Vietnam, and I remember, that we had to stay in and we had to continue the carnage because of our credibility at stake. I mean, I think, if we have a policy that's not been great, we should change it. I'm not optimistic, I guess, that we're going to see changes in a good direction, but I think it's something that we can fight for, and we should be, I think, not just the progressive Democrats. I mean, Obama was and Clinton were actually outliers in the party and pushing so hard for the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. And I hope that this is an opening, maybe not under the Trump administration, but maybe under some future administration toward a more progressive trade policy that would continue to be rules-based, but rules that were more had more egalitarian impact.
Um, so when you say rules-based international order, um, uh, I guess I think of two things. One, I'll address um, secondly, and that's about, yes, sorry, I'm thinking through this. Okay, so I'm a scholar of international finance, the politics of international finance. And finance, the politics looks really different from trade. So I just want to say a couple things about that. It is a rule-based order, but not probably the one that you're thinking of. So first of all, quickly with finance, even in the post-crisis era, there's just not the same kind of coalitions that you will find, say, in the factions fighting over international trade. You got Occupy Wall Street, but that sort of fizzled. People, I think, thought it would be more lasting. There's new advocacy organizations looking out for consumer protections and Finance Watch. There's Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, of course. But I guess my assessment here is in the United States, post Dodd-Frank, there really isn't the kind of coalition that can take on the industry lobby in a consistent, sustained way. Nothing. So even when we talk about um, finance in politics in Washington, in policy debates, we're talking about domestic politics. Nobody's really talking about international finance except for the lobbies themselves. So
And
for
you.
this, what's that?
And you.
And me. And for this and other reasons, I just am I feel pretty confident in saying that the Trump administration is going to continue, especially given the Treasury nominee, continue the U.S. position as a big supporter of international finance. There's been, since Dodd-Frank, sort of the flip side of some of the ratcheting up of domestic financial regulation has been what people call a fragmentation of regulation along national borders, which has meant that it's more expensive for financial firms to operate in other countries. But more expensive is not the same thing as really undermining international finance, and I would say international finance is in pretty good shape from the point of view of the industry. That's not to say they don't want more. The industry would like more harmonization, and they would like some watering down of Dodd-Frank. So I think we'll probably see that. But on the other hand, here's the rules-based part. This is really a very hard area to think about the future of international finance. It's very, there's a lot of uncertainties. And that is because the U.S. the days when the U.S. could make policy unilaterally are long over. Um, so there's a number of international constraints on what the United States can do in the area of finance. So one constraint comes from the fear of a potential regulatory race to the bottom. And here the issue is that the US, along with the EU, was the key designer of what people call the post-crisis international financial architecture. So in finance, there's, like I said, there's no equivalent to the World Trade Organization. Instead, you get this, which is treaty-based. Instead, you have soft law, a string of standard setters out there who are loosely organized under now, post-financial crisis, under the G20. Um, so the idea here is that the US and the EU put together this arrangement in part to prevent upwardly mobile financial centers in Asia and the Middle East from offering lax regulatory regimes. And you know, this was at the time when the US and the Europeans were ratcheting up their reforms, so they were very concerned about this for competitiveness reasons and others. So any move suggesting that the United States would be loosening regulation and violating some of the soft agreements about financial regulation would give license to other jurisdictions. And so I see this as a constraint. And I should probably note, however, that there's a lot going on here, and London's divorce from the EU through Brexit could also trigger a downward spiral as London tries to redefine itself. One more thing here is that I see another constraint that I've studied at length. It started really in 2002, and that is that the United States has to be mindful of what other large um, jurisdictions do. And in particular in finance, it's the EU, because the EU has a massive financial services market, capital markets and banking markets. And US firms make some U.S. firms leading international firms make 25 to 40% of their revenues in Europe. And so what we learned in the early 2000s is that once the Europeans got their act together, they created this thing. It's like I guess it's an equivalent of a customs union for financial regulation. So to operate in Europe, you need to comply with European law, and it's harmonized now. And even without London, though there's a lot of uncertainty there what it'll look like, even without London, US firms will want to be able to participate in European markets. And the Europeans, just like they've done in chemicals and data privacy, they will make it expensive for US firms if they deem US regulation not to be equivalent. So there's another constraint there that the Treasury and other institutions in Washington might feel constrained by. So I'll get to my other point later because I've been talking a while. So I'll pass it on now.
With respect to the rules-based, the concern with maintaining the rules-based system, I think that the comments the president-elect has made with respect to NATO are extremely concerning, obviously. And but I'll just go back to trade because this is an area where not only I have expertise, but an area where I think that this discussion of rules-based, of having the importance of having a rules-based system is needs to be kind of centered along the right axis. The right axis is this system is set up, the international trade system is a system that is set up by the United States with in cooperation and coordination with European countries and Asian countries and other parts of the world. But this system is a system that recognizes the interests of the participants in the system, and that over time there has been a deviation by the system from the actual allocation of the actual power or allocation of these interests within the system. A good example, again, the second aspect that the administration is going to reopen NAFTA, the second biggest other than rules of origin, is going to be the NAFTA binational review system. The United States, by the way, has never won an appeal at NAFTA. Never. Never won an appeal at NAFTA when it was appealing a decision against its trade agencies, which is a very important aspect. There's a lot of judicial activism in these institutions. There's a lot of judicial activism in the WTO, at the WTO panel level and at the WTO appellate body. The United States went through the Obama administration. This is no President Trump. This is Obama administration went hard against this past summer against the reappointment of a South Korean member of the appellate body, and they are normally appointed to one term, but typically without controversy reappointed for another 4-year term. The United States basically blocked the appointment of this South Korean gentleman who was basically playing funny games. He was basically deciding cases, raising issues that were not raised by the parties, and using those issues as issues that were dispositive on the cases, which is a complete legal no-no. Only a kangaroo court would do that. So the system is due to some rebalancing according to the interests and the stakes of the parties involved. And I do believe that the United States is not only looking, will be not only looking at revisiting the system based on the evolution of how the system has deteriorated, as well as based on its own perception of what it can do and with whom it can do deals. Uh, so so it's not so much, it's not so much a rupture with a rules-based system. It is a rebalancing of a rules-based system so that it reflects actual leverage in the system. And right now, it doesn't square away. The WTO is a morbid organization because it has lost its relevance. The WTO, dispute settlement body, has basically degraded into what is similar to the European Court of Justice, which is one of the reasons why Prime Minister May of the UK basically said, we're going to make a clean break. We do not want the European Court of Justice having supreme authority over our laws because, as you know, because they have usurped the power since 1958 from the member states, because it's a game that an European bureaucracy and a European-based supranational judiciary has played, and the Brits this time, the UK has basically said, we're going to put a stop to this. Well, the United States may do the same thing. It looks like it's going to do the same thing with the NAFTA system and possibly with the WTO system. They have run away. They basically engage in activism so that they basically aggrandize their own powers. It's quite revealing that all former members of the appellate body, including some U.S., criticized the U.S. very harshly when the United States blocked the appointment of the South Korean member. And curiously, South Korea basically threatened that it was going to block all future appointments to the appellate body, and basically pulled out from that threat because we have a new member of the appellate body, and not that one. The United States objected. So I think the system is supple enough, or should be supple enough, to accommodate changes as time passes. Just as the changes and the deterioration through activism and through, usurpation of power by bureaucrats in the EU system should accommodate changes, or otherwise it faces, death with disintegration in Europe. So I think that we have come to a point where the system is rebalancing numerous systems. And it was already happening under an Obama administration. It's just that people were not paying attention. And now, because we have a more flamboyant, a more sometimes scandalous president-elect, we are paying attention to all these words that are said. But the system was due to a rebalancing, and we need to do that. So on IPRs, on intellectual property rights, my quick comment is it was it was something that promised a lot to the United States, and the United States got very little out of it. So, and by the way, even when the United States pursues it under TPP and under TTIP, uh, 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 really, what is the role of protecting monopolies for overextended periods of time? I mean, who does that benefit in the American society? And what kind of leverage are we as a government, giving away by just basically pushing these IPRs to other countries? I think we need to revisit that. I'm not sure the current administration is going to question that aspect. So that would be a potential point of criticism. And finally, the notion of pacta sunt servanda, right? Agreements are supposed to be fulfilled. Yes, a reopening of NAFTA is not a break with NAFTA. It's a reopening. It's a normal procedure. A country can withdraw from an agreement, and that does mean that the country is in breach of that agreement. And I think that wise parties and cooler minds that seem to populate at least the trade team that the President Trump has been putting together, they seem to know exactly what they want, and they are communicating a very coherent message. And I think that's going to be a good message, uh, uh, potentially good message for the United States, because it has a lot of leverage that it has not used for decades, and it seems that it's ready to use now. Let's see whether that happens or not.
All right. So death, morbidity, and the degradation of the system, a very cheery note to end on. But as promised, let me open up to the floor. We have a microphone. We are going to be broadcasting this online later. So if you do have questions or comments you'd like to make, A, we hope you'll come forward, and B, we'll hope you'll use the mic so that the people watching you live or online can also hear it. We have about maybe 10 minutes for questions. Please.
I basically have two quick questions. Was watching television, I believe it was Fox News yesterday, and they're talking about an American clothing manufacturer, North Carolina, Tennessee, someplace, small town, that if he imported his material for suits from overseas, he paid a 25% tariff. And if the material was sent to Canada, I don't know what their tariff was, but his complaint was that they didn't, by the time it was reimported to the U.S. due to the content rule, they didn't pay that tariff. And second, deals with corporate taxes. What would be the effect of the U.S. reducing corporate taxes and adopting a European-style VAT tax so that everything sold in the United States would leave some money in the United States, not just sent overseas? And that would apply both to U.S. companies doing business in Europe and European other countries doing business in the United States. Thank you.
Let's take a couple, actually. So I think there were a couple other people who had questions over here.
So one campaign pledge I'd like to talk about is the elimination of 2 regulations for every new regulation. What's your best guess for how that plays out and how that affects international trade?
And in the middle there as well, if you please.
Taking into account U.S. credibility, how would, or what, I guess, would stop other countries or other companies like Carrier from sort of threatening to move their manufacturing to other countries like Carrier did, I guess, and to extort tax dollars or other benefits?
Mhm.
My question, well, the trade agreements seem to take a little bit of time to kind of germinate and move along. And one question I have is might happen a little more quickly because it's tax policy, and that is the repatriation of companies that are doing businesses overseas. The poster child I'd have here is Eaton Corporation here in Northeast Ohio, which merged with a Texas company and emerged as an Irish corporation. And now they're saying that if they move back to the United States, we've got to, there are tax policy questions that have to be addressed, and I wonder how that plays into your international calculations as well, because if companies are coming back from Europe, how does Europe respond?
All right. So let's hold off on that, and then maybe we'll start with Professor Claris and move down the road this way. If you have any comments or feedback or responses to the questions that were posed, Professor Claris, that'd be great.
Uh, with respect to your question on the North Carolina clothing company that can get textiles for cheaper if it imports more manufactured or more value-added textiles from Canada because it comes in at a very low tariff level. Mhm. Yes. They definitely did the Canadians because they it's not that they're gaming the system, they're taking advantage of the rules they negotiated. And so to say that Canada is gaming the system would be unfair, but Canada is basically doing what's in the best interest of Canada. And because I just hope we can remind ourselves that we should not criticize the United States so much for renegotiating the agreement. That's working very well for Canada. And not accuse the United States of being an isolationist country for basically saying, wait a minute, we Canada has recently signed a free trade agreement with the European Union, right? CETA, and the United States, I mean, took note of that. Do they honestly believe? Does Canada honestly believe that with a, a a continuation of the trade consensus in Washington D.C., they were not NAFTA was not going to change, and basically they were going would be able to you know take advantage of these rules of origins and basically rules of origin has to do with how much from outside NAFTA a product can contain and still qualify for duty-free treatment, right? So the Canadians were clearly and I don't mean in a bad sense. They were using the rights under their agreement. Let's call it gaming, but it's not. It's not nothing dishonest. They were doing what they were entitled to. The point is we have to stop that because if you want to have if you want to have manufacturing here, if you want to take a look and take note of those things, we need to act accordingly. Now the question is whether we want when the more you do the more you intervene in these topical areas, the more you disturb these big supply chains. So there's a trade-off between whether you disrupt big supply chains but in pursuit of leverage that you have in a bilateral relationship, or whether you don't disrupt these supply chains, but then you have more trade, but then you're going to have definite losers. So that's the big question. The past administration, since FDR until now, the choice was almost invariably on the side of keeping these supply chains least disturbed as possible. The rules may be changing now, so that would be a good thing. And so I think I should take only that question and then leave the others. One question for.
Sure. Okay, I'll take there was this question about regulations, the two, getting rid of two for each new one, and I thought that was campaign rhetoric. I mean, because it's probably not that hard a thing to do because there must be just a gazillion old regulations that have no bearing any longer on. But you would maybe know more, Sue, than I. But what I wanted to say here was that the connection between regulation and international trade is really interesting. I talked a little bit about this. I think that's where a lot of the action is today with tariffs relatively low. And it takes us right back to this question of values and how you work through these these regulations from different countries. I mean, this is this is why I mean, you would think that TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, that is going nowhere anytime soon, you would have thought that that would be the easier one to negotiate. But in fact, it was extremely difficult, uh, in part, because of this values issue, which really rallied a small social movement against it in Europe. But there were um, uh, I like to think that um, this is an area that has a future, especially for the United States, because uh, what happens usually in these arguments is that it's the U.S. versus the Europeans, and then other countries follow suit because they need to meet the same regulations in order to get into the two markets. So as I think, what could the future trading system look like? I think here's one focus is on um, working out, smoothing out the regulatory bumps, this would say.
Cool. I guess, yeah. So I think on this, I mean, it's really great. I think too often these values questions are not brought up, or they're brought up as the Europeans have hidden protectionism because they want to have a precautionary principle, for example, that, prove that you're doing no harm rather than assuming there's no harm for a new chemical or something.
Even if after 25 years there's been no evidence that GMOs are actually harmful.
Well, I think there's different arguments about it. We can take that up as a different. Some of them are clearly protectionist, but not all of them are. In any case, and I think if you think one example of a free trade agreement is what we have between the states of the U.S. And there we have endless amounts of discussion of states' rights and different values and around guns, for example, or civil rights or things like that. And a question would be, how I think the way Elliot phrased it, we may decide, well, we actually can't trade with societies that are even more different over some things, and maybe that's fine because we actually place some values higher than sort of freedom of shopping. On the Eaton thing, I think that this is a great area for trade policy. Instead of focusing on how do we make ordinary workers very vulnerable to competition, it's how do we prevent international tax evasion. So I think there's actually some room for alignment across governments on that, and that would be very cool. I don't know what the prospects are, but it would be a very cool area for cooperation. The question about what stops others from threatening to move now that they see that you can get bribes to not move once you threaten, I think that's a great question, and I think is a real problem and actually a reason for a rules-based policy. I criticize particular rules, but that doesn't mean that I'm opposed to rules, and I think that's an exact reason why we want them.
Yeah. Let me just end by responding to your question, sir. I don't actually know what the manufacturer was, or maybe if they were actually making suits in Canada and then sending the suits as finished products. So that's a different. That would be a different tariff, because the way our tariff system work is, if something is substantially transformed, a different tariff is applied to it. So the U.S. manufacturer is just importing textiles. The Canadian was as well, but then taking those textiles to make suits and then sending the suits down here. That's for tariff purposes, that's a different product. And so that's not even gaming the system. That's just the way the system operates. But it raises a larger question, which is who actually who is harmed when you raise tariffs? And it's a good point because it shows that a lot of American companies actually source their products from abroad, and if you raise tariffs on products abroad, that means they're going to be more expensive for you and me because we're going to buy them here, and the 25% is going to go up to 50% or whatever it is, and that's going to raise the cost of goods for all of us. And more generally, we think of the U.S. Always as sending things out, but we also attract a lot of investment as well. And so lots of foreign companies have car manufacturers and others employ American businesses here. So we also need to understand that we are part of a larger network or a global network of trade and investment. And even if we are the largest among the primus inter pares, the biggest among equals, we are also subjected to and benefit from free trade and free investment. So, or freer trade and freer investment. So I would also say that once we also need to think about how these raising tariffs or obstacles to investment would also harm American workers who are employed by Toyota or who are employed by Nissan or who are employed by BMW in U.S. factories. So we'll cap it there. I thank the remaining audience for barreling through to the end. We will have a reception outside. There's some food and drinks right over there. But please join me in thanking our three panelists for their wonderful remarks.